Imagine, like just for a second, that you are looking at a map of your own hometown.
Okay.
But this map wasn't drawn by you or, by anyone who actually lives there.
Right.
It was drawn by someone who just kind of flew over it once in the dark and arbitrarily decided to label your street as like savage territory
Yeah.
and your local park as a primitive wasteland.
Yeah.
And your own house is just labeled in need of civilizing.
That's incredibly bleak.
It is, but that is exactly what the literary map of Africa looked like to the Western world for centuries. I mean, it was a landscape drawn entirely by the people who had colonized it.
Yeah.
Until one man came along, took a look at that map, and just decided it was time to redraw the entire world from the ground up.
And, the sheer scale of that mapping project it's just staggering when you consider the historical weight he was pushing against.
Oh, absolutely.
We're looking at a figure who didn't just write novels. He basically engineered a cultural earthquake. Chinua Achebe took the novel, which was, let's remember, a tool historically used by European colonizers to sort of justify their own empires.
Right.
And he forged it into a weapon to reclaim a continent's history. He was pushing back against this deeply entrenched narrative that just dismissed African history as, well, in his own words, a long night of savagery.
A long night of savagery. That's such a heavy phrase. And to really grasp how he dismantled that, we have this massive stack of sources curated for this deep dive today.
I really do. It's a lot of ground to cover.
We're synthesizing Dr. Jasvant Rathod's extensive lecture notes, some incredible historical texts, deep literary critiques from the Routledge and Penguin Classics Guides, and some incredibly rich primary source excerpts.
Especially from his satirical masterpiece, A Man of the People. That one is, well, we'll get into it, but it's fantastic.
Yeah.
It's so good. So whether you are prepping for a seminar, or you're brushing up on post-colonial theory, or you are just, fiercely curious about how literature actually shapes reality, the goal here is to cut through the academic jargon and get straight to the aha moments.
Exactly.
But to do that, we have to start at the foundation. We have to look at the specific, deeply conflicted world that actually forged Achebe. He called it the crossroads of cultures.
And that crossroads was very literal. I mean, Albert Chinua Achebe was born in 1930 in Ogidi, which is a town in eastern Nigeria.
Right.
And the defining feature of his early life was this profound, inescapable duality. So his father, Isaiah Okafor Achebe, was a devout Christian catechist.
Okay.
He was a teacher for the Church Missionary Society. Both of his parents were these committed evangelicals. So inside their home, life was dictated by strict Christian teachings, hymns, the Bible, Victorian English values.
Wow. Okay, so very rigid. Very. But the second young Achebe stepped outside the walls of his family compound. The extended family and the whole broader community of Ajedi were still deeply immersed in traditional Igbo religion. Customs, rituals, all of it.
It's like growing up with two completely different operating systems running your life simultaneously.
That's a great way to put it.
Because inside the house, you've got this imported colonizer's faith. It's rigid, it's textual, it's focused on a singular God and a very specific mode of salvation.
Right.
And then, you step outside and you are immediately surrounded by an ancient oral tradition. Local festivals, the pantheon of Igbo deities, ancestral spirit.
And these incredibly complex social codes that had sustained the community for centuries.
Exactly. You are essentially living in two different centuries at the exact same time.
And Achebe later referred to himself as a prodigal son because of that exact dynamic.
A prodigal son, how so?
Well, his Euro-Christian upbringing initially created this sort of dislocation from the history and traditions of his own Igbo culture. He was raised to look slightly askance at the quote-unquote heathens outside.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, but as he matured, this double consciousness became his greatest asset as a writer. It gave him this crucial, critical distance.
Meaning he wasn't totally blinded by either side.
Exactly. He wasn't so completely inside the traditional culture that he couldn't see its flaws, right? But he also wasn't so indoctrinated by the West that he couldn't see the beauty and the complexity of his indigenous roots.
That makes total sense.
It prevented him from writing a purely idealized, utopian version of the African past. When he looked at pre-colonial Africa, he saw the rich philosophy and the vibrant community, but he also saw the brutal practices and the rigid hierarchies.
Which is so much more honest. And that brings us to the catalyst, the moment the fire really gets lit.
Yes.
So Achebe goes to University College, Ibadan. Initially, he's there to study medicine, right?
Right, but he pivots to English literature.
And the curriculum there is, like, entirely British. Shakespeare, Wordsworth, Milton.
Purely colonial education.
Right. And then, in 1952, he reads a book that completely alters the trajectory of his life. It's a novel called Mr. Johnson by the Anglo-Irish writer Joyce Carey.
Oh, boy. Yeah.
And it is breathtakingly racist. I mean, it depicts Africans as primitive, unthinking, almost childlike savages.
And the historical context of that novel makes Achebe's reaction even more poignant, honestly. Joyce Carey actually served as a colonial officer in Nigeria.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. And when Mr. Johnson was published, Western critics lauded it as a sympathetic and accurate portrayal of Africa.
You kidding?
No, they genuinely thought it was a progressive book. But to Achebe and his Nigerian classmates reading it in university, it was grotesque.
I can only imagine.
The protagonist, Mr. Johnson, is a Nigerian clerk working for the British, and he is portrayed as a total buffoon. He's deceitful, driven purely by basic urges, incapable of complex thought.
And just embarrassingly obsessed with his white superiors, from what I read.
Exactly.
But, you know, if I read a book that completely degraded my heritage like that, my first instinct would probably be just pure disgust.
Sure.
I might just throw the book across the room, decide English literature is fundamentally broken, and just walk away. Why did this offensive, condescending book actually inspire him? Why didn't it just paralyze him with anger?
Because it was a realization of power. Achebe saw that anger just wasn't enough. Correction was required.
Correction.
Yes. He realized that if he and his peers didn't write their own people's story, the derogatory narrative of the West would permanently cement itself as the accepted historical truth.
Oh, wow. Yeah, if you leave the storytelling to the colonizer, you will always be the savage in the narrative.
Exactly. He understood that the African story was being broadcast to the world by people who didn't understand the language, the culture, the internal logic, or, frankly, the fundamental humanity of the people they were describing.
So the outrage became like an activation energy.
It became a lifelong mission to correct the historical record from the inside out.
And he doesn't just do this through writing novels immediately, which is fascinating. After graduating, he actually goes into media.
Right?
He joins the Nigerian Broadcasting Corporation, the NBC. He's producing radio talks. He's immersed in the oral culture. And he eventually becomes the director of external broadcasting.
He is quite literally the voice of a newly independent Nigeria, broadcasting its culture to the rest of the world.
But then the political tectonic plates shift violently in 1966.
They do. The post-independence optimism just shatters. Political and ethnic tensions in the Republic boil over into a military coup, which is then followed by horrific counter-coups and massacres.
And the violence is overwhelmingly directed at the Igbo people in the northern part of the country, right?
Tragically, yes.
Yeah.
And this systemic slaughter sparks the Nigerian Civil War, which is widely known as the Biafran War, that lasts from 1967 to 1970.
Right.
The eastern region, which is predominantly Igbo, secedes to form the independent Republic of Biafra. Achebe, facing the attempted extermination of his own people, leaves his comfortable post in Lagos.
He gives it all up.
He becomes an official cultural ambassador for Biafra. He's traveling the globe, trying to raise funds and awareness as his people are subjected to this brutal blockade and mass starvation.
The trauma of that war is almost unfathomable. I mean, the images of starving children with kwashiorkor from the blockade,
Yeah,
they shock the entire world.
he was devastating.
Achebe loses close friends, too,
Yeah,
including the brilliant poet Christopher Okigbo, who dies fighting on the front lines.
yeah.
And that trauma, it leaves a massive scar on Achebe's output, doesn't it?
A massive one. There is a staggering 21-year gap between his fourth major novel and his fifth.
21 years.
Yeah. I mean, he writes poetry, he writes essays, he teaches. But the grand, sweeping novels just stop for 2 decades.
It must have been a period of intense national and personal grief.
He had to completely recalibrate what it meant to be a writer when the nation you were writing for has literally been torn apart by civil war.
Wow.
He spent much of the subsequent decades teaching, holding posts in both the U.S. and Nigeria, and then tragedy struck again in 1990.
The car accident.
Yes. A car accident in Nigeria left him paralyzed from the waist down. He spent the remainder of his life in a wheelchair.
But he never stopped working.
Never. He held prestigious academic posts at Bard College and Brown University in the U.S., continuing to write, critique global politics, and mentor new generations until his death in 2013.
Okay, so we have a man forged at the crossroads of colonialism and tradition, activated by racist literature to reclaim the pen, and deeply scarred by the violent birth pangs of post-colonial Africa.
That context is absolutely crucial.
It is. Because before we open the pages of his masterpiece, we have to know who is holding the pen. So in 1958, he publishes Things Fall Apart,
The blueprint.
the undisputed blueprint of post-colonial fiction. It has since sold over 12 million copies. It's been translated into over 50 languages.
And to understand why it's so revolutionary, we have to look closely at its setting and its protagonist.
Let's do it.
So, the novel is set in the 1890s in Umuofia, which is a fictional cluster of Igbo villages. This is a very deliberate choice by Achebe. He sets the story just before the British arrive and then depicts the exact moment of colonial impact.
Right.
And our window into this world is Okonkwo.
Okonkwo, man, what a character.
He is a self-made warrior, a champion wrestler who famously threw Amelun's the cat, and he's a wealthy farmer. But beneath this towering exterior, Okonkwo is driven by a pathological, consuming dread of being perceived as weak or soft or what he considers womanly.
And that neurosis stems entirely from his father, doesn't it?
Entirely, Unoka.
Right. Unoka was everything Okonkwo despises. He was a gentle, flute-playing man who hated the sight of blood. He died deeply in debt without any tribal titles and suffering from a swelling illness.
Which the culture considered an abomination.
Right. Meaning he wasn't even given a proper burial in the earth. So Okonkwo builds his entire identity as this violent overcorrection to his father's legacy.
Dr. Jaswant Rathed's lecture notes in our sources actually emphasize a fascinating dynamic here. Rathed points out the, quote, dialectical relationship between Okonkwo's individual psychology and the structural transformation of the entire village of Umuofia.
Let me jump in there because I was reading through Rathed's notes too, and that phrase, dialectical relationship, sounds a bit like heavy academic speak.
It does a bit.
But parsing through it, Rathed is essentially saying that Achebe constructs Okonkwo's personal neuroses, like his toxic obsession with manliness, as a microcosmic mirror of the clan's macrocosmic vulnerabilities.
Yes.
To put it simply, Okonkwo's rigidity is a magnifying glass for the hidden cracks in the entire village's foundation.
Exactly. The society rewards strength, ambition, and achievement, which Okonkwo has in spades.
Right.
He embodies their ideal of success, but he takes it to a fatal extreme.
He strips away all the necessary counterbalances. I mean, the society of Umuofia values masculine achievement, sure, but it equally values balance, consensus, and peace.
And Okonkwo completely lacks these traits. He is so terrified of weakness that he constantly violates the spiritual laws of his own people.
Give us an example for the listener.
Well, he breaks the sacred week of peace by beating his wife, Ojugo, simply because she was late preparing a meal.
Right.
And the priest of the earth goddess warns him that this offense could literally ruin the entire clan's harvest. Later, he participates in the killing of a hostage boy, Ikemefuna.
This part is so brutal.
It is. Ikemefuna lived with him for years and called him father. The village elders tell Okonkwo not to bear a hand in the boy's death, but when the men strike Ikemefuna, the boy runs to Okonkwo for protection.
And Okonkwo cuts him down.
He cuts him down purely because he is afraid of looking weak in front of the other men.
I keep coming back to this analogy in my head. Okonkwo is like a massive, rigid, concrete building constructed in an earthquake zone.
Oh, I like that.
Because he associates any kind of flexibility, any swaying or yielding with femininity and weakness, so he absolutely refuses to adapt.
Right.
And the problem with concrete in an earthquake is that because it refuses to sway when the tectonic plates shift, when the colonial forces arrive and disrupt the entire social order, the building doesn't just crack, it shatters completely.
It shatters completely. The tragedy is that his rigid defense of the culture is actually an assault on its core values. And this introduces a really crucial theme in Achebe's work, the feminine principle.
Let's unpack that.
In Umuofian culture, the ultimate judge of morality, conduct, and fertility isn't a male warrior god. It's the earth goddess, Ani. She is explicitly female.
Right.
The most sacred principles are peace, nurturing, and community cohesion. By violently fleeing from everything he labels as womanly, Okonkwo is actively fleeing from the moral foundation of his own people.
He thinks he is the ultimate defender of Igbo tradition, but he is actually violating the very culture he claims to be protecting.
Exactly.
As the critic Abiola Iral points out in our reading, Okonkwo is pursued by this feminine principle throughout his life, and he is ultimately vanquished by it.
It's profound. Achebe is demonstrating that a healthy culture requires a balance of both poles, male and female, action and reflection, rigidity and flexibility. Okonkwo's violent imbalance is his tragic flaw.
And the brilliance of Things Fall Apart isn't just confined to its plot or character psychology, is it? It's baked into the actual structure of the prose.
It really is. We have this incredibly deep critique in our sources by Abdul-Yan Muhammad concerning Achebe's concept of sophisticated primitivism.
Sophisticated primitive.
Yes. And his syncretism of oral and literate modes.
Okay, I want to spend some time on this because Jana Muhammad's concept is mind-blowing once you unpack it. He points out that Achebe takes a Western chirographic form, meaning a written, literate form, the novel, which was literally invented by Europeans, and he structurally subverts it by writing it in an oral paratactic style.
To explain parataxis in plain terms for the listener, it is a grammatical structure where you place clauses one after another without using coordinating or subordinating conjunctions to show their logical relationship.
Okay, give us an example.
So, it's how human beings naturally speak when they are telling a story aloud to an audience. In a traditional, Western, heavily literate novel, you might write, because the heavy rains came in late July, the yam crops flourished, which ultimately led to a bountiful harvest festival.
Very flowery. Very cause and effect.
Exactly. But a paratactic oral style strips all of that away. It says, the rains came in July, the yams grew, the village celebrated the harvest.
Oh.
It relies entirely on rhythm, repetition, and the active engagement of the listener to connect the cause and effect.
So Achebe is essentially trapping the rhythm and the soul of an ancient oral storytelling culture inside the architecture of a British literary novel.
Yes.
He is taking the colonizer's master tool and bending it to house an African spirit. When you read the book, it doesn't sound like Charles Dickens or Thomas Hardy. He recreates the syntax, the pacing, and the proverbs of the Igbo language in English.
It's a revolution.
It's not just a story about Africa. The text itself behaves like an African elder sitting by a fire telling a story. It dismantles the racial codes of colonial literature, not just in what it says, but in the very mechanics of how it speaks.
It forces the Western reader to slow down and adapt to an entirely different cognitive rhythm.
Wow.
But Achebe's project doesn't end with the initial shatter of colonialism. The tragedy of Okonkwo is just the first domino.
Right, the timeline moves forward.
Once that rigid structure shatters under British rule, the pieces that get put back together form something mutated. Achebe maps this trajectory across his subsequent novels, tracking the evolution of the state from colonialism directly into post-colonial corruption.
Following Dr. Rathard's framework, we see how the initial crack widens into total systemic collapse.
We see the transitional phases of this collapse clearly.
So, in Arrow of God, set in the 1920s, we watch Izulu, a chief priest of a local deity, exhibit massive hubris. He tries to outmaneuver the British colonial administration, specifically Captain Winterbottom. But he also uses his power to settle local political scores.
Which is disastrous.
Right. He arrogantly delays the yam harvest to punish his rivals, which ends up starving his own people and driving them straight into the arms of the Christian missionaries who offer them food and spiritual amnesty. He destroys his own religion from the inside.
A total self-inflicted wound.
And then, in No Longer at Ease, set in the 1950s on the brink of independence, we follow Okonkwo's own grandson, Obi. Obi receives a prestigious British university education paid for by his village. He returns to Lidos, taking a job in the civil service.
And Obi's tragedy is entirely different from his grandfather's. He isn't rigid, he's hopelessly compromised.
Yeah.
He is caught in this impossible double bind. He has the crushing traditional expectations of the Umuofia Progressive Union, the village elders who paid for his schooling and expect a return on their investment.
They want their money's worth.
Exactly. But simultaneously, he is drowning in the corrupt, hyper-materialistic demands of the modern Lagos bureaucracy. He tries to be an idealistic, honest civil servant, but the financial pressures and the systemic rot slowly grind him down until he, too, slides into accepting bribes.
It's tragic.
But
the narrative shifts from tragic to ruthlessly, darkly satirical when we enter the fully post-independence era with his 1966 novel, A Man of the People.
Oh, this book.
We have a massive primary source excerpt from this book in our stack, and it is a goldmine for understanding post-colonial politics.
It really is.
The premise centers on a clash between two men. Our narrator is Odli, a cynical, university-educated young teacher, and his foil is Chief the Honorable M.A. Nanga. Nanga is a phenomenally corrupt, deeply charismatic, aggressively anti-intellectual politician. He is the titular man of the people.
And Achebe's portrayal of Nanga is a masterclass in political satire, precisely because he makes Nanga so terrifyingly likable and effective.
Yeah.
Let's look at the opening scene at a Nada grammar school where Odili is teaching. Minister Nanga arrives for an official address, and the local villagers essentially commandeer the school.
It's chaos.
Absolute chaos. Achebe paints this vivid picture. You have local hunters dressed in full traditional regalia, wielding loaded Dane guns like playthings in a crowded schoolyard.
Oh my God.
They are firing off precious gunpowder into the air just to greet the minister. And Odili sourly notes that the cost of gunpowder had recently quadrupled due to the rampant inflation caused by Nanga's own corrupt government.
The irony is suffocating. Odili is standing off to the side, intensely bitter, watching these poor, exploited villagers dancing themselves lame to honor the exact politician who is robbing them blind.
And there's a local woman leading the singing.
Oh, gramophone.
Yes. Her nickname in the village is Gramophone, which is just a fantastic, evocative detail, and she is singing at the top of her lungs about Nanga's handsomeness and greatness.
And orchestrating this whole circus is the proprietor of the school, Mr. Nuge.
Mr. Nuge is the archetype of the desperate sycophant trying to scramble up the post-colonial ladder. He's hovering around Nanga, practically vibrating with the hope of getting a government appointment to some obscure, useless board that disposes of old government junk.
Odili despises Nuge. He tells a hilarious, pathetic story about Nuge's past to undermine him to the reader.
The bicycle story.
The bicycle story. So, years ago, Nuge was riding a rickety bicycle with no brakes down a steep hill, barreling straight toward a parked lorry.
A disaster waiting to happen.
In his panic, instead of ditching the bike, he yells to the pedestrians, "In the name of God, push me down."
Which is just absurd.
Right, and nobody moves to help him. So as he gets closer to a fatal crash, he adds a financial incentive. He yells, "Push me down and my 3 pence is yours."
Push me down and my 3 pence is yours. I love that.
Push me down and take my 3 pence. It becomes a legendary joke in the village. And during the assembly, while Nuge is giving this incredibly boring, bloated speech introducing Nanga, a young man in the back of the crowd yells out that exact phrase.
Push me down, take my 3 pence.
The crowd erupts in laughter, completely deflating Nuge's pompous moment. But Achebe uses this comedy as a Trojan horse.
He really does.
Amidst all the laughter and the drumming, we get the dark backstory of how Nanga actually seized power. Nanga totally weaponizes his lack of education. He plays the anti-intellectual populist card to perfection.
Odili recalls the moment everything changed. Years prior, Nanga was just an unknown, uneducated backbencher in parliament. A severe financial crisis hit the newly independent country.
Okay.
The Minister of Finance, who was highly educated, proposed a rational, austere economic plan to save the economy. But the Prime Minister, seeing his popularity dip, fired the Finance Minister and his educated allies.
Just got rid of them.
Fired them. He claimed they were conspirators and decadent stooges versed in textbook economics.
A classic populist purge.
Exactly. And Nanga saw his opportunity. He stands up on the floor of Parliament and yells that the educated ministers deserve to be hanged. He leads the pack of hounds. He rides this wave of manufactured anti-intellectual rage right into a highly lucrative ministerial seat.
Wow. And there is a brilliant tense moment in the excerpt where another teacher, Andrew Kadibi, accidentally calls Nanga by his old nickname from his teaching days.
MA minus opportunity.
Yes, MA minus opportunity. It's such a cutting slight.
It really is.
Basically means you strut around acting like you have a Master of Arts degree, but you don't, and you cover it up by saying you just never had the opportunity.
Right. And back when Nanga was a poor teacher, he actually liked the nickname. It made him feel smart.
But now,
as a powerful minister whose entire political brand is aggressively anti-intellectual, he visibly snarls at it. The jovial facade drops for a split second, revealing the deeply insecure autocrat underneath.
it perfectly illustrates how these new post-colonial leaders were agonizingly insecure about their actual qualifications.
They compensated for their lack of expertise with raw, theatrical power, wealth accumulation, and populist rhetoric. But Achebe doesn't let Odili off the hook either.
No, he doesn't.
He doesn't just indict the corrupt politicians, he turns the mirror entirely around on the intellectual class.
And this is the crux of the novel for me. Odili despises Nanga. He sees through the facade. He knows Nanga was part of the pack of hyenas that destroyed the only honest politicians in the country.
Right.
So why, when Nanga casually invites Odili to come stay at his mansion in the capital, does Odili instantly say yes?
It's a great question.
He ends up staying in Nanga's luxurious guest room, marveling at the 7 gleaming bathrooms and the imported carpets. Why does the principled intellectual sell out the moment he's offered a comfortable bed?
Because this is Achebe's most unsparing, brilliant insight into the mechanics of corruption. Odili judges Nanga from a distance, sure, but the moment he is allowed inside the gates, he is completely seduced by the exact same material comforts. Achebe is demonstrating that the intellectual class's moral high ground is incredibly fragile, largely because it hasn't been tested by real temptation. Odili experiences this profound, cynical epiphany while lying in Nanga's luxurious double bed, which he describes as feeling like a cushion of air.
I actually want to read the exact quote from the excerpt because the metaphor he uses is stunning.
Go for it.
So Odili is lying in the air conditioning, thinking about the state of the country. And he thinks, a man who has just come in from the rain and dried his body and put on dry clothes is more reluctant to go out again than another who has been indoors all the time. The trouble with our new nation was that none of us had been indoors long enough to be able to say, to hell with it. We had all been in the rain together until yesterday.
That metaphor of the rain and the shelter, it explains the entire post-colonial dilemma.
It really does.
Achebe is arguing that the British colonizers built a massive, comfortable, air-conditioned shelter powered by the extraction of the country's wealth. When the British finally left, a handful of locals, the ruthless, the lucky, the charismatic ones like Nanga, scrambled inside the house and barricaded the door.
They locked the rest of the country outside in the rain.
Exactly. And then they used state-controlled loudspeakers to tell the people shivering outside that any dissent or protest is unpatriotic and will bring down the house.
Oh my goodness.
And Odili realizes in that bed that he doesn't actually want to tear down the corrupt house, he just wants his own room inside it. He hasn't been comfortable long enough to have the moral fortitude to reject the luxury.
It's an empathetic indictment. You almost understand why they do it, even as you watch the rot set in.
Absolutely.
Speaking of the rot setting in, we have to talk about the OHMS coffee anecdote from the excerpt.
Oh, this is the best part.
It is, without a doubt, one of the darkest, funniest scenes Achebe ever wrote. Odili and Nanga go to visit another corrupt cabinet member, Minister Chief Koko.
Right, and Chief Koko is this fat, jovial, wildly wealthy man. They're sitting in his opulent mansion, and his cook brings in coffee. Koko takes one sip of his hot coffee, violently drops the cup on the floor, and starts wailing, "They have killed me! They have poisoned my coffee!"
He loses his mind.
He is absolutely terrified, rolling his eyes, sweating profusely. He is demanding his cook be brought in, utterly convinced he is the victim of a political assassination attempt via a deadly African poison.
And the cook is dragged into the ruin by Koko's cowboy-style bodyguard. The cook is terrified, trembling, but he has the presence of mind to defend himself. He grabs the spilled coffee cup, pours the dregs into his own mouth, and drinks it to prove it isn't poison.
It's such a dramatic scene.
He begs his master, "Why would I kill my master? Am I crazy?" And then he reveals the real mystery of the terrible-tasting coffee.
Right.
He explains that they ran out of the imported Nescafe, so he had to brew locally processed coffee that he bought from a government OHMS truck.
And the punchline here is layered with such bitter irony. OHMS stands for Our Homemade Stuff.
Our homemade stuff.
Yes. It was a massive, nationwide government propaganda campaign run by these very ministers, urging patriotic citizens to buy locally made products to support the domestic economy. The vans driving around the villages with loudspeakers hawking these goods were literally called OHMS.
So this powerful minister thought he was being assassinated by a political rival, but he was actually just being poisoned by the toxic substandard goods produced by his own government's fake nationalist campaign.
Exactly.
He is terrified of the very products he is forcing the poor to consume.
It's a devastating critique of the hypocrisy of the post-colonial elite. They preach economic nationalism and sacrifice to the impoverished masses, while they themselves demand imported European luxuries. When forced to consume the reality of their own domestic policies, they literally mistake it for lethal poison.
Achebe uses humor not just for a laugh, but as a scalpel to expose the absolute moral rot at the very center of the state.
He does. But, exposing this post-colonial corruption creates a massive dilemma for Achebe as a writer.
How do you mean?
Well, how do you write a devastating critique of the colonizer and the corrupt politicians who replaced them while still being forced to use the colonizer's language? He isn't writing political manifestos, he's writing novels in English. How does he maintain his authenticity? He had a very clear, highly debated philosophy about this. He saw the writer not just as an entertainer, but as a social corrector, a teacher. He famously declared, "African people did not hear of culture for the first time from Europeans."
I love that quote.
Literature, for Achebe, was a crucial form of social practice, and his primary weapon in this practice was the Africanization of English.
You see this instantly with his use of proverbs. The study guide highlights how Achebe famously describes proverbs. He says they are the palm oil with which words are eaten.
A beautiful metaphor.
For the Igbo, palm oil is an essential ingredient in cooking. It makes the food palatable and rich. In speech, proverbs aren't just like local color or quaint little sayings used to dress up the dialogue.
Right, they aren't decorative.
Exactly. They are the actual vehicles for indigenous philosophy, legal precedent, and complex rhetoric.
When a character like Obiyurika or Izulu uses a proverb, they aren't just being poetic, they are directly referencing a vast shared legal and moral database of the Igbo people.
But Achebe's choice to write these proverbs in English sparked one of the most massive historical debates in African literature.
It really did.
I am so glad we are getting into the Ngugi wa Thiong'o debate. Ngugi is the great Kenyan writer, and at the 1962 Maker Conference of African Writers, he famously argued that African writers should entirely abandon English and write solely in their indigenous languages.
And honestly, you can see his point. If your goal is to decolonize the mind, why would you use the language of the people who enslaved and colonized your ancestors?
Right. Isn't writing your masterpiece in English a fundamental form of surrender? Why didn't Achebe just write Things Fall Apart in Igbo?
It is a vital, ongoing question. Achebe's counter-argument to Ngugi was incredibly pragmatic, but also deeply subversive. Achebe argued that English could be colonized from within.
Colonized from within.
Yes. You have to remember the geographical reality. Africa is a massive, multi-ethnic, multilingual continent. Nigeria alone has hundreds of distinct languages. Achebe argued that by taking English and forcefully bending it, making it carry the weight, the rhythm, and the idioms of the African experience, he was creating a unifying tool that could reach across ethnic lines.
He effectively weaponized the colonizers' language against them.
Yes. He forced the Western world to read African experiences on African terms, but in a language they could not ignore or dismiss as inaccessible.
That is so smart.
He claimed English as a global language, stripping it of its purely British ownership. He felt that the English language was capable of carrying the weight of his African experience, provided he altered it to suit its new African surroundings.
And he didn't just play defensive language. He went aggressively on the offensive against the Western canon.
Oh, yes. The 1977 lecture.
Yes. Achebe travels to the University of Massachusetts and delivers a lecture called An Image of Africa. And he takes direct aim at one of the most revered, untouchable novels in the Western literary canon, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness.
The fallout from that lecture cannot be overstated. Up until that moment, Heart of Darkness was universally taught in universities as a profound, enlightened critique of European imperialism.
It was untouchable.
Achebe stood at the podium and methodically dismantled it. He pointed out that Conrad used Africa merely as a dark, primeval backdrop for Europe's own psychological breakdown.
Right.
He analyzed Conrad's specific passages, noting how Conrad denied Africans human language, reducing them to grunts, frenzied dancing, and rolling eyes, while contrasting the civilized Thames River with the savage Congo River.
And he didn't mince words. Achebe stated flatly and without apology that Joseph Conrad was a thoroughgoing racist, and that a novel which celebrates the dehumanization of a portion of the human race cannot be called a great work of art.
It was an absolute earthquake in literary criticism. He offended a lot of legacy academics, but he forced the entire global academic community to fundamentally reevaluate how they read and teach literature.
And because Achebe dared to rewrite the African narrative and challenge the Western canon so aggressively, the academic world has been fighting over how to read Achebe himself for decades.
Oh, absolutely. The critical battlefield surrounding his work is immense, and the sources in our stack heavily disagree with each other.
We can categorize these battles to make sense of them. First, we have the clash between universalist and post-colonial readings.
Right.
On one side, you have traditional Western critics like the famous scholar Harold Bloom. Bloom argues that we should read Okonkwo purely as a universal, classic, Greek-style tragic hero.
He compares Okonkwo to Oedipus or Macbeth, focusing entirely on the formal, aesthetic qualities of the tragedy, his hubris, and his inevitable fall.
But the post-colonial critics push back fiercely on that interpretation. They argue that stripping Okonkwo of his specific colonial and historical context, ignoring the fact that he is an Igbo man dealing with the violent invasion of the British Empire in the 1890s, is just another insidious form of cultural imperialism.
It's the West essentially saying, this story is only valuable if we can make it about us, about a universal human nature that we define, rather than about specific African history.
Exactly. The post-colonial critics, like Simon Gikandi, insist that you cannot separate Achebe's aesthetic form from the brutal political and historical reality he is documenting.
But the debates are even more fractured when we look at gender. There is a fierce, highly detailed feminist critique of Achebe's work that emerged strongly in the 1980s and 90s.
Let's dig into the specific charges leveled by critics like Florence Stratton and Andrea Powell-Wolf because they make very compelling arguments.
They do.
Wolf looks at Achebe's early novels and argues that he essentially writes off polygyny, the practice of men having multiple wives, as a non-issue. She argues he uses the number of wives purely as a metric to discuss male status and wealth, completely ignoring how intrinsically destructive and limiting that system is to women's autonomy.
And Stratton's critique goes even deeper into the structure of the novels. She acknowledges that Achebe celebrates the female principle, in theory, the reverence for the earth goddess Ani, the idea that mother is supreme when a man is in exile.
Right, we talked about that earlier.
However, Stratton argues that while this principle is exalted symbolically, actual living female characters are structurally marginalized and silenced in the narrative.
So they're symbols, not people.
Exactly. She contends that the female principle is used merely to validate a male nationalist agenda, while real women are kept strictly on the periphery of the action, the decision-making, and the power structures.
Those are heavy charges. But there is a very strong defense against this in our sources, too.
There is.
Critics like Biodun Jiifo and the historian Nwando Achebe warn against the danger of imposing modern 20th century Western feminist standards on a historical 19th century Igbo setting.
Right.
They argue that Achebe is simply functioning as a realist. He is accurately, unflinchingly documenting a patriarchal society as it existed. But more than that, they argue he actually embeds profound moral authority in the female figures, even if they lack overt political power.
The defense centers on the idea that Achebe isn't endorsing the patriarchy, he's diagnosing its fatal flaws. Remember, Okonkwo's downfall is explicitly repeatedly tied to his violent rejection of the feminine.
Right.
Achebe is showing his readers that excessive, unchecked masculinity is toxic and ultimately suicidal to the community.
We promised you, the listener, that we wouldn't take sides in these political debates, and we won't. The goal is to understand the landscape. Achebe's early texts undeniably depict a patriarchal world where women lack the political agency of men. Yet, Achebe is also clearly diagnosing the fatal flaw of that very patriarchy. It is a testament to the sheer depth and complexity of his work that it can support such intense, divergent critiques decades after publication. He didn't write a simple fable. He created a living, breathing world that scholars are still actively fighting over.
He proved that the African story was not a blank, savage space for Westerners to project their fears onto. It was a complex, flawed, beautiful, and deeply human reality that demanded to be engaged with on its own terms.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought drawn from Biodun Jiifo's essay in our sources. It's a concept he calls the predicaments of Obiorika.
Obiorika.
Now, Obiorika is Okonkwo's best friend in Things Fall Apart. He is the foil to Okonkwo's rigidity. Obiorika is thoughtful. He actively questions the harsh traditions of his clan.
He wonders why he had to throw his own twin children into the forest just because tradition demanded it.
Exactly. But he doesn't openly rebel. When the British arrive, Okonkwo violently fights them and dies a tragic death. But Obiorika survives. He lives.
And Jiifo points out a haunting reality here. While Okonkwo is crushed by the collision of cultures, Obiorika lives on into the new colonial era.
Right.
But what happens after a culture survives a massive collision? What is the ongoing psychological cost of adaptation?
That's the real question.
As Jiifo notes, for those who survive into the neo-colonial present, that survival is not triumphant. It is often haunted by a sense of failure. It is the heavy, suffocating guilt of having compromised, of having stood by and watched while the old world fell apart, of having learned to speak the colonizer's language just to survive.
Think about your own life, your own culture, or maybe an organization you belong to. When the world changes rapidly, when the tectonic plates of your reality shift, is it better to be the rigid concrete building like Okonkwo, standing firm in your absolute principles until you break and are destroyed?
Or is it better to be Obiorika, bending, adapting, surviving, but having to live every single day with the heavy, compromising guilt of knowing what you let go of and who you let die, just so you could survive? It is the ultimate question of the modern era. and Achebe leaves it entirely in the hands of the reader to answer.
Next time you look at a map, remember that someone drew it with their own agenda. And if you don't like the boundaries they've drawn for you, pick up a pen. Go pick up Achebe's novels. Look for the palm oil in the words themselves.